They've also, very importantly, said, look, don't blame us for the delays in handing over these hostages, these dead hostages. Israel is obstructing the excavation work and making it very difficult for them to do it. Israel says, for its part, that they don't trust Hamas. They think it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely Hamas that's breaking the ceasefire. By the way, remember when everyone was talking about how like Hamas is doing field executions, like this is unjustifiable. And then all of the human rights organizations that work in Gaza came out in unison and were like, hey, by the way, we realize that there is a lot less interceptions taking place at the point of aid distribution and delivery since Hamas has overtaken control over the parts of Gaza that Israel isn't currently occupying. Oh my God, how interesting how that works. It almost feels like the Israel-backed militants in Gaza that are, you know, drug dealers and ISIS affiliates and whatnot were directly contributing to the destabilization of the Strip by attacking aid delivery. Interesting how that works. And remember when day one everyone was like, why aren't pro-Palestinians celebrating the ceasefire? Because the ceasefire never actually took complete hold. Yeah, Bibi had a court day today. I don't want to lean too much into the whole, like Benjamin Netanyahu is using the plight of Palestinians and like hitting the let's kill more Palestinians button over and over again in a way to avoid his own legal battles, because I feel like his own legal battles are somewhat inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but the timing of it is always suspicious.
It's deliberately dragging this process out for as long as possible to toy with the emotions of the families. And other analysts in this region have said to me, well, actually, Hamas may well be kind of playing for time here, because they worry that when the International Stabilization Force comes into Gaza and Hamas is obliged to hand over its weapons, it wants to be in as strong a position as possible so it doesn't basically get overrun by some of the armed clans that exist in Gaza. Highly complicated situation.
Frank, in terms of the American position, are you clear about that? Because since the ceasefire plan was signed up to, they have actually at different points said that and have acknowledged that actually it will be difficult in part for Hamas to retrieve the bodies because of the rubble and all the rest of it. So where are the Americans in where we've arrived at today?
Well, up until 24 hours ago, I would say that the bulk of the US pressure has been on Israel, primarily a restraining hand. If you remember, about 10 days ago, a couple of Sundays.
Once again, this framing is so crazy. Obviously, BBC is just like unlimited dick riding for Israel as always. But the framework is always so crazy because like they make it seem as though like Israel is an unstoppable force, like a hurricane or a volcano or something. And it's like, oh, well, there's a lot of restraint coming from the Trump side against Israel. And it's like, okay, well, doesn't that beg the question that Israel is the one who has been serially violating the ceasefire? What are we talking about, man? What the hell?
Ceasefire on paper, but sporadic major strikes from Israel, and the thought about whether that would be the template that the Israelis use. Because the worry here is that this ceasefire plan has the potential to unravel with what we've seen even in the last couple of hours.
There is that. So let's just kind of remind ourselves where we've got to. This is the tail end of phase one of the Trump 20-point peace plan. All 20 living Israeli hostages had been returned. That's a plus. Nobody can take that away. That is a major achievement, along with the release of over 1,700 Palestinian detainees that were taken from Gaza, plus around 200.
Yeah, major achievement that was the Hamas framework since like October 10, 2023, by the way. Virtually all the parts of the Gaza phase one ceasefire plan was already what Hamas had said yes to, with the only exception of Israel not like removing its military from the entirety of the Gaza Strip. The only thing that they had considered a red line that they had to say yes to in the first phase was that Israel would maintain troops in like 50% of the Gaza Strip. That's the only thing that they said yes to that they hadn't said yes to prior. And obviously the scary aspect of this was that Israel was going to consistently violate the ceasefire and continue bombing and continuous genocide after getting all of the Israeli hostages, the Israeli captives. We're back at it.
50 convicted criminals.
They said yes to that? No. In the first phase, they agreed to removing all of their leverage. The only leverage the Palestinian Resistance Front has against Israel was the captives. And they said that their red line was a full withdrawal from the Strip. It seems to me like there was a new calculation by the Palestinian resistance that the captives were no longer a point of leverage that they could use because Israel just didn't give a shit. And the rest of the world didn't give a shit either. And Israel would just seemingly consistently say, well, they have our hostages, so we can bomb all the Palestinians and keep putting pressure on the entire civilian population of Palestinians by continuing this genocide as a point of leverage. Just like aid distribution, which is a war crime, by the way, to the civilian population, a captive civilian population, was used as a point of leverage in the negotiation side for Israel. It's ridiculous.
In Israeli jails. That bit has happened. But what's the
It's not argumentative nor a trap. Calling them captives instead of hostages, is that accurate and right? Were they not civilians? No, the last batch was, the last 20, I think, were all Israeli occupational forces soldiers. And what's interesting is there was one person actually that was captured at Noah Argamani's boyfriend, who also, it later came out, was also I think like Israeli Secret Service or something. So every single remaining captive at that point were Israeli occupational force soldiers. As far as the Palestinian hostages goes, they are straightforward hostages. Like for the most part, they're like doctors, regular civil society servants, things of that nature. I'm sure there's some militants that they have been able to capture in the process as well. But oftentimes they just kill the militants even before they actually apprehend them and prosecute them. There wasn't like 1,700 Palestinian militants that they captured and then released back into Gaza. They were all civilians. I'm not sure the wording matters, to be honest. Even if they're military, they served the purpose of a hostage. Is hostage carry a connotation we don't like or something? No, there's a difference between prisoners of war and hostages. That's why. There is like at least a legal gray area for prisoners of war versus hostages where there is no legal gray area. Under international law, obviously genocide is illegal, but nobody gives a shit. But considering the asymmetry that exists for the resistance, that was illegal. It was always illegal. Capturing civilians in the process of a military campaign is illegal. There's no question about it. Now, of course, when you look at the legality of the actions of a resistance group, you have to match that with what they are facing, right? The severity of the crisis. If you're looking at like 75 years of apartheid and occupation and sovereignty over this indigenous population, then of course the dynamic shifts a little bit. It's like looking at the Nat Turner rebellion and then not matching that up against the severe death and destruction that black people faced under chattel slavery, and simply just looking at that in and of itself and going, wow, that was really fucked up. They slaughtered babies in their cribs, right? Like, what the that's crazy. They slaughtered white babies in their cribs. Like, yes, it was brutal. Yes, it was horrific. Having said that, the legalized practice of chattel slavery was so far and beyond more horrific than the singular act of violence that was born out of the Nat Turner Rebellion that like it doesn't even make a blip. That's the reason why you look at like ANC and the way that they dealt with collaborators as opposed to the legalized practice of apartheid, and you say, okay, well, at least throughout history, people have overall, when they are atoning for what the resistance has done in the process of liberation, they oftentimes will be much more charitable to the resistance front and the actions, no matter how violent they are, because they understand that the violence that they were subjected to, that they were trying to end, is far more consequential and systematized.
Inside Gaza Strip, and this yellow line that has got the two sides very close to each other, plus the fact that Hamas has yet to hand over the remaining remains of dead hostages, and this deep suspicion on the Israeli side that Hamas's excuses are not genuine. They do not believe, the Israelis simply don't believe that Hamas is doing its best to find them and hand them over. They say they've got evidence that Hamas knows exactly where all the bodies are buried. It's simply toying with people's emotions. Hamas is saying, cut us some slack. Gaza Strip is rubble. Much of it is reduced to, some of these bodies are buried under tons of rubble. It's going to take a while. We need excavation equipment, which the Egyptians have sent, and don't obstruct us. We need time to find them. So it depends which side you want to believe.
Frank Gardner, live for us there in Jerusalem. Thanks for bringing us right up to date. Thank you.
That's the latest updates from Israel, which is unfortunately the type of update that we're very familiar with, where one side ceases and Israel fires. This is exactly what happened in Lebanon as well. This is exactly what happens all over the place because Israel gets to operate within the confines of American protection. And that is the reason why it is more important than ever to basically stress the Trump administration and the American side to forcibly put the restraints on Israel because they're violating Trump's big, beautiful deal and potentially violating Trump's big, beautiful Gulf deals that might come along in the aftermath of this ceasefire. So it's imperfect. It sucks. Like, who gives a shit about the narcissistic man-child? What is this? It's interesting how Hassan uses the word resistance. I absolutely agree with what Israel has done as genocide and terrorism, but isn't calling what I perceive as Hamas something relatively positive as resistance? Aren't they a terrorist just like Israel government and Zionists? No, they are a part of a national resistance front because October 7 is not the pivotal turning point of this, of the plight of the Palestinians. They are objectively a national resistance front. They are a part of the national resistance front, a resistance to the occupation, not just a resistance to Israeli genocide, but a resistance to the Israeli occupation and sovereignty over the indigenous Palestinian population. They are quite literally resistance. The reason why people don't use that terminology, and this is where, we get into words mean something. The reason why a lot of people say, no, you mustn't call them that, you have to call them terrorists, is because terrorism is a loaded term. It's a vague term, and it is a term designed to deny the people any sort of due process so they can be destroyed, they can be killed. And in Israel's case, they can even end up collateralizing all of the other civilians that are around what Israel has declared and what the American government continues to say are terrorists. I'm sure you've heard the term one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, but that is kind of the dynamic. It's reductive to say it like that, but it is kind of the dynamic. And I think you can see this dynamic actually play itself out right now in Latin America. Okay, America is currently using that vague definition of terrorism that they've slapped on to every single person that is sailing on a boat off of their own coastlines to illegally and extrajudicially murder random people on boats and then say they're narco-terrorists. That is perhaps one of the greatest examples of how silly this entire process is. They call them narco-terrorists. And when you call someone a terrorist, when the American government or the Israeli government or one of the allied nations calls a group of people terrorists, more often than not, they're not white, by the way, then they can get away with doing whatever the they want. It seems like in the U.S. anyway, resistance carries a positive connotation and evokes ideas of fighting against oppression, while terrorism carries a connotation of nonsensical and unlimited violence. Maybe militant is a neutral version, but I don't know if it has any connotation. Yes, but it is perfectly valid to both call Hezbollah and Hamas and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and even Palestinian Islamic Jihad, regardless of their own personal ideologies, regardless of how they think Palestinian society should be run, to be the militant front for national resistance. For Hezbollah, it is a Shia paramilitary group that was designed specifically to fight back against Israeli incursion inside of Lebanese borders and to also protect the Shia population against sectarian violence that was taking place, oftentimes directed by Western leadership and specifically by Israel. And as far as Hamas goes, as far as all of these groups go, if you look at the actual history of the term terrorist being utilized, the first time that it was ever found as a legal definition was actually in response to, I believe, the PLO. Ironically enough, we started calling Palestinian resistance groups terrorists all the way back decades prior to the term becoming much more broadly accepted in the aftermath of the war on terror after 9/11. No, it's not back in the 90s. It's even before then. Actually, the DFLP hasn't been designated a terror org for multiple decades. Yes, because they've been successfully dismantled. That's the reason. They are incredibly marginal. John Brown was both a militant and a terrorist in the context of the state at the time, but was still just, despite the label. The words don't really matter. News is always propaganda, for example, despite the negative associations with the word. Yes, exactly. That's a lie, by the way. The U.S. government just went after a charity for being a front for material support for PFLP and terrorism. Yes, PFLP and DFLP are different. PFLP has a little bit more motion than DFLP. And they just don't really exist at all. At least PFLP has like maybe 100 people, but the Democratic Front is virtually non-existent as far as I understand. Even though the limited amount of people that are a part of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which by the way, PFLP and DFLP are both different Marxist tendencies. They're socialist formations. They used to have a lot more membership. They used to have a lot more, DFLP split from PFLP back in the day. But regardless, one of them is, I think, Maoist. I think DFLP might be Maoist. It doesn't really matter. They are super, super marginal, okay? They are very marginal in the grand scheme of things. Like the resistance front is predominantly led by Hamas. Hamas has taken over the PLO as like the organizing factor as a part of the militant resistance front. And one of the successes that they have seen is that they've been able to combine the entirety of the resistance front. So it's mostly Hamas that has the largest number of militants, largest number of armed combatants, and followed closely by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Hamas, however, unlike the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, also has a civil governance component in Gaza, whereas the Palestinian Islamic Jihad is not a real party anymore. Like they have no interest in, at least in the last couple of decades, they have not necessarily had any sort of investment in operating as a part of the political infrastructure of Palestinians. They are more so a militancy. They don't do a lot of politics. They just have a brigade. What's interesting, at least in my experience, and maybe I'm a little bit wrong about this, but like PFLP in their heyday was actually quickly eradicated by Israel because they saw PFLP as a real threat, because they could do an international Marxist call to arms and they could get support from other existing international Marxist organizations. And that was a major problem for the Mossad. That was a major issue for the Mossad. So as opposed to how much motion that they previously had, the amount of motion they have now is fairly limited because they were part of an international Marxist movement, which is precisely the reason why you had the Japanese Red Army faction that would go to Lebanon and train with the PFLP and then would go and hijack planes and stuff back in the day. And many of them were Christian too. Many of them were Christian Palestinians. And Israel assassinated all of them, including their leadership, alongside their family members in places like Lebanon, like Ghassan Kanafani, who had never actually held a weapon as far as I understand. He was specifically a writer, and yet Israel killed them all the same. This does not mean that there weren't militants within the PFLP. Of course, there were, but Israel killed the militants and the non-militants all the same. And of course, even then, their militancy was certainly valid. They were resisting against an oppressive settler colonial apparatus that was backed by the entirety of the Western world at the time.